In this video, we're going to wrap up our equipment system. We're going to fix an important critical bug, but more importantly, maybe, at least more fun, is we're going to make it so that we can change equipment and have it update our player sprite sheet so that we can change appearance while we're playing our game. Hi, my name is Michael. Welcome to my 2D action and adventure RPG tutorial series. Follow along and learn how to create your own ARPG in Godot 4 using GD script. So, we've been working on this equipment system for a little bit now. We're on to the fourth video, and in this video we're going to do kind of one of the most fun steps, and it's actually going to be simpler than you might expect, but we're going to swap the sprites of our player and the weapon as the equipment changes. Now, the one caveat is that this does require a lot of work when it comes to developing or creating the art assets that are needed to do this. And so, you know, while the code implementation of this is going to be quite simple and straightforward, at least in the version I'm going to show, there's obviously a lot of work behind the scenes. And I've kind of, you know, taken the easy way out with the armor, and I've just simply recolored the sprites for this. So you would probably want to take some time to change how the cape looks and things like that. Now, that being said, you will need the assets for the player sprite and then the sword assets. And let's go ahead and take a look at these real quick. I've already brought them into my project. Okay, so under the player folder, I've got sprites, and I've got player sprite, which is just an updated version of the player sprite ninja suit, player sprite sword, and player sprite sword katana. So make sure you grab those. You can download them on my itch.io page, and they're part of the player equipment zip file. And then once you get those into your project, we're ready to go. Okay, so let's actually look at this sprite file real quick. Even though I'm not going to step you through drawing this sprite, I do want to show you kind of how I've set this up. So this is an example. I've got the player sprite with the ninja suit here, and you can see that the weapon is no longer a part of any of these animations. Okay, and what I've done is I've separated this out, and I did a live stream where I worked on some of this, but I've separated this out to this other sprite sheet file. I have a player reference in here, but I don't actually export that. I just have the sword, and I have a layer for when the sword is below the player and one for when it's above the player. Okay, and so you can see I've got the sword in its sheath, and a good example of this is like this charge up. You can see that this sheath is in the above layer and the sword is in the below layer. And so when we bring this into the game, we're going to have our player sprite. We're going to have parts of the weapon that are above and part that are below. And in order to export this, when I export this file, I'm going to show you some settings here. I'm going to split the layers. So you can see I only have 2 layers made visible, above and below. And so when I split the layers, what's going to happen is you can see I'm keeping my export kind of similar to how I've exported the player sprite. You can see all of the frames, but you'll notice there's a lot of gaps because first it's exporting what is below the player. Okay, and then down here below, what it does when you split the layers, see if I turn this off, you can see all of them are combined. And then as soon as I split, we get the below and the above exported in separate frames. And so basically we've got the same format. It's in one file, but we've split those in 2. Now you could also just export the above and the below sprite sheets as separate sprite sheets, and that's an option too. So if you want to do that, the implementation will be basically the same, but the code will be slightly different. And that'll make sense when we get there. But if you have questions about how I've done this, go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I'll see if I should make a video about this more in depth. But otherwise, let's get back over to Godot. All right, so let's get into the player. Let's open the player scene. And I kind of want to show you something. You've probably noticed in my recent videos that my player no longer has the sword because I've already brought in these new sprite sheets for the player. And so the player sprite itself doesn't have the weapon. And I'll just point this out with the game running so you can see what I'm talking about. So no weapon on his back. And of course, when I attack, I've still got the slash effect because that was already a separate sprite sheet, but you can see the player's not holding a sword, okay? And that's because, again, I've stripped the player sprite down to just the player himself and no weapon so that they're separate and it's easy to implement this feature that we want, okay? In order to make this work, we're going to have to add some additional sprites to the player scene. So let's go ahead and do that. So what we're going to do is let's look at our player sprite. So the sprite 2D is where the player sprite is. You can see the texture here. We've got the regular player sprite assigned. That's fine. We don't need to do anything with that sprite. But what we need is we're going to need some other sprite sheets that we can use to add the weapon to. And so let's go ahead underneath our player Sprite 2D. Man, I keep clicking on that. And let's add 2 more Sprite 2Ds. So let's see, Sprite 2D. I'm going to drag this to the top up here, and let's just call this one weapon underscore under or below. We can call below. And then before we make, we're going to need one for the above, but let's go ahead and grab our sprite sheet that we want. And we'll start with the regular player sword sprite and just assign this. And you can see it's got all the stuff in there. We've got the frames that are below and the frames that are above. And how this is going to work is we're going to go into the animation. We have 16 horizontal and vertical frames in this sprite sheet. So we can just put it on 16 on both. And right now this sprite sheet is above the player, but we want this one to be below, right? Because this is going to be the sprite sheet. We've named it below. So all we're going to do is we're going to come into the visibility, and there's this option to show behind parent. We'll just turn it on. There we go. So now that one is below the player. And then let's go ahead and duplicate this sprite sheet. And I'm going to rename this one, instead of below, we'll call it above. And it's already kind of configured, right? We've got the sprite sheet. Let's go ahead and for the visibility, we'll turn the show behind off. Okay. And then by default, I want to set this frame to frame 128. So there's 128 frames per each section. Okay. So frame 128 is where it starts back over. And you can see that it's transparent because there's nothing on that frame for the above. Okay, so I hope that makes a little bit of sense. And then what we're going to do is we're going to use code to help us keep these frames animating in sync. If we were to run the game right now, you'll see that the sword itself is not going to do anything, right? Okay, because it's just stuck on that frame, but we'll go ahead and update that. All right, so let's make it so that these sprite sheets will keep in sync with the player. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a script to our player Sprite 2D, and we're going to use this to help control those. Okay, so let's go to our player folder, and in our scripts folder, we can just create a new script, and I'll call this player Sprite. And let's go ahead and apply this script to our node and open it up. Now, we don't necessarily need to give this a class name right now. I have no need to reference it, but I do want to change this extends to Sprite 2D. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a few variables. We're going to track our sprites, and then we're only going to need to do basically 1 or 2 functions. One functions and some things that we do in the process frame. And so let's begin. The first thing I want to do is add a constant, and this is going to be called frame count. Now this variable or this value is an integer, and it will be used to keep track or to tell us how many frames there are in our sprite. So because we've split our sprite in half and there's 128 frames for the first, for the below sprites, and then 128 for the above, this number is just going to help us be able to do the math a little bit. And then let's get some references to our sprites here. So drag those in. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the Sprite 2D underscore on these. So it's just weapon below and weapon above, just to simplify those names. Then let's go ahead and get this set up. We're going to need a ready function. But we aren't going to use that just yet. Okay, we'll use that when we connect to our inventory so that we can update things. And then we're going to use our process function. So func underscore process. And we aren't going to need the delta here. So I'm going to just put an underscore in front of the delta so that it doesn't give us a warning that we have an unused variable. And then lastly, we're going to make a function that we'll call on equipment changed. This is the function that will connect to our equipment change signal from our inventory. So we'll use that later as well. So to begin, then we just need this process function. We're going to use this to update the frames of our weapon sprites. Okay. So this is actually really simple. And what we're going to say is weapon, and we want to start with the below maybe. So weapon underscore below dot frame. There is a frame property, and we can update this manually. And so what we're going to do is every time the process runs, we'll just make sure that this updates to have the same frame. So we can say this frame equals, and then frame, because the frame, right? This is a Sprite 2D that we've got this on. We're just going to have it match the frame. And then let's just go ahead and run that so you can see this working. So now you can see that the sprite, when it's below the player at least, is updating. And you can see the sword sometime there, sometimes it's not, right? That's because we've only applied this to the weapon below sprite. So if we apply it to the weapon above, then we should start seeing the sword when it should be above the player as well. So we'll just simply set the frame equal to frame, and we'll run one more time. And voila. We've got some issue there, don't we? It looks like, oh yeah, really obvious, because we set this to the frame that we're on. We actually don't want that, because remember, we want the below ones to be offset. So this frame count, that's where this comes into play. So we'll just add the frame count. And now if we run again, now it should work a lot better. Wah, wah, there we go. So you can see we've got the sheath is above the player, the sword is below him, etc. And it should work for all of our animations because they've all been built in there. And everything's looking pretty good. Okay, so that's a real simple way that you can just sync up sprites. Now this works because we want these sprites to match the animation, and they've been set up to work that they match the animations of our player. If you had weapon sprites that didn't match the animation of the player, then this solution might not work for you. But even if your weapon sprite animations didn't match, but maybe you had above and below, you could at least sync those two, so you only had to animate one of them. But this is just a nice, handy way to keep our different sprite sheets in sync. Now that we have our weapon sprites animating with the player, we need to be able to work on handling the equipment change. And before we can do that, we need to have a way to get a reference to the textures that are associated with each weapon, because right now we have no way of determining, what sprite sheet to use when we change equipment. And so we need to go into our items script folder and open the equipable item data. And we're going to need to add an additional variable here. So right now we have a type and we have the modifiers. Let's go ahead and export one additional variable that we'll call sprite texture. And this will be of type texture, okay? Just like that. And once we save this script, we're going to need to go through our different equipable items and update that texture. So for this ninja suit, I'm going to come here where it says sprite texture, and I'm just going to load. And you can see I've got my player underscore sprite underscore ninja suit. That's the texture I want there. Go ahead and save that. Tunic, I'm going to do the same thing. Now the tunic is going to be using just the player sprite texture. Okay, so just select that. And then let's go down to our weapon for our iron sword. Quick load. What's it called? Just sword. So we've got player sprite sword. Save that. Lastly, the katana. We'll quick load this. And it does have katana in the name. There we go. So I've got all those saved and updated. Now we can go back to our player sprite. In the player sprite script, we're going to find our inventory. So we'll go player manager and get the instance of our inventory data. And the inventory, if you recall, has this equipment changed signal. And so we'll connect to that. And we'll just use our on equipment changed function that we've already set up below. So now we just need to code this function, and it's going to be quite simple as well. So let's get a reference to our equipment just to make this a little bit easier. So the equipment is an array of slot data, and this will equal our player manager dot inventory data. And then we have that function to get the equipment slots. It's just called equipment slots, just like that. So that's going to give us all of our equipment. Now, if you remember, our armor is the first element in our equipment slots, and the weapon is the second. So at index 0 and index 1. And so we can use that to our advantage here. Now, rather than trying to determine which piece of equipment changed, because this function is only going to be called when we actually change equipment, so not very often, I'm going to go ahead and just swap the armor and the sword, even if they don't change. So what we can do is to swap the armor, we just need to swap the texture on this node because we're looking at our player sprite right now. So we can just say texture equals and then grab the texture from our armor equipment. So that's going to be equipment at index 0 dot item data dot sprite underscore texture. Now, if this works, I should be able to run the game and swap out for this ninja suit. So when I equip this, there we go. You can see that it changed the sprite sheet that we're using for the player. Easy peasy, right? And because the ninja suit has the exact same frame layout as the other player sprite, it just works. So that's something that's obviously important, right? All of your sprite sheets need to have matching frames for each animation. Okay. And let's go ahead and do the same now for our weapons. We've got 2 weapon sprites. We've got our weapon below and weapon above. So let's do weapon below.texture equals, and then we do basically the same thing. I'm just going to copy this. But instead of grabbing the item at index 0, we will get it at index 1. Then I'm going to copy this, paste it, and this is going to be weapon above. Okay, so let's run the game and test one more time. And I don't have a weapon to equip until I get one, I guess. Okay, there we go. We've got the katana. So now if I equip the katana, boom, you can see it updated the sprites for that, which the katana is fun. I like the red handle and the little dangly bits. And there we go. Different animations, okay? So it's really as simple as that. Just swap those out. Now, if you wanted a complete, paper doll system, you could increase the layers and you could have like head and body and legs. It gets a little bit more complicated in knowing how to stack them, but the principles that I've outlined in this video can be used to accomplish a system like that. And it just takes a little bit of work, a little bit of planning. All right, so everything's working great, but there is one more thing I want to do, and there's a bug with the code that we've done, how we've implemented our equipment system, and I wish I would have addressed this earlier because some people might not make it this far. Let me demonstrate the bug real quick. So in our game, we've updated some of the code on how we handle items, and I need to get a consumable real quick. Okay, there we go. We've got an apple. Now, this is fine. Everything seems to work good until we use an item and we run out. You'll notice that we're trying to access the quantity on a null, an object of type nil, meaning we don't actually have anything left in that slot, okay, because we've used up the apples. So we just need to account for this little bug, and I want to do that right now. And the fix to this is actually going to be quite simple. Let's go ahead and just right here, obviously this line is where we're hitting that error because we're trying to update the label. If we look at our item use function though, if we look at our slot data, and this is actually kind of tricky. So in the slot data, we've got this thing where it emits changed, and then that emit change is going to hit somewhere in our inventory, and I'm having a hard time remembering where to track it down, but what happens is if there's none left, then it just clears the slot, and it doesn't happen in here. It happens elsewhere, but it does happen before our code gets here. So all we have to do though is check if slot data equals null, okay? Because if that slot data is null, then we have nothing to set the quantity with. So this little return here should fix it, okay? If there's no slot data, don't do that. So let's just run, and let's go get ourselves a consumable and test this out one more time. Okay, got an apple. There we go. We were able to use the apple, or it could be a potion, and all good. Okay, so that's it for this video. Nice, short, and sweet. And we should have a fairly fully functioning equipment system now that is far more robust than what we've had before. And I hope that these concepts and how I'm working with the sprites are beneficial and useful for everybody. Go ahead and drop a comment if you have any questions, or if there's anything else along the lines of this equipment that you'd like to see. And subscribe to my channel if you want to see what's coming next. And of course, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters and thank them for their support. And as always, we'll see you next time.